multi-million-dollar houses.
Well, David, congratulations on your book.
Thank you very much.
I thought you might like to just do a quick introduction about what exactly is your book about. Explain to the watchers of this program what exactly you're trying to get across.
As the title suggests, Scott, Brisbane Breached, the story of a drought-defaulted floodplain, goes to depict the fact that Brisbane is both prone to very, very substantial and heavy rain events, yet it has a long-term default of drought. That if you look over the long history of Brisbane, it has been in a phase of drought and dry weather, much more so than the flood events, which, though spectacular and newsworthy and noteworthy, are, to be perfectly honest with you, outliers, which means that we therefore have a real and genuine issue and problem in the lead up to the 2032 Olympic Games of water supply. How do we feed and water an ever-increasing population of Brisbane, as per the predictions of 1 million more?
Well, now tell us, do you think Brisbane, everyone tells me that Brisbane's been built on a floodplain.
Yes.
So is it sort of a city being built in the wrong place, do you think?
That's the unfortunate way that we would look at it through a retrospective lens, Scott, that really and truly, in fact, I'd almost analogise the Brisbane River catchment to a mushroom that's inverted by 90 degrees, with the stem of the mushroom being the river going out to Moreton Bay, but the head of the mushroom being the broader catchment that goes as far north as a latitude congruent with Maroochydore, as far south as the state line, as far west as to Whitcomb, almost near Toowoomba, which is a vast repository of water that has only one outlet, and that's therefore the head of the mushroom releasing by the stem of the mushroom, which is the Brisbane River, and as we know, it's a fairly narrow channel at times, and hence the reason why the flooding is so pronounced in places like the CBD, Milton, Rosalie, Goodna, Graceville, Chelmer.
Now, I'm from Ipswich, and my family's lived in 38 Brisbane Street, Ipswich, for 100 years or more, and we've been flooded quite a few times, and I rode out my grandfather in 1974 with his bag of money because he didn't trust banks. So we've been through quite a few floods ourselves and cleaning up the mess afterwards. So we've got all these houses now built on basically a floodplain, and you say, do you think also one of the other problems is that house design has gone the wrong way? We're building houses on cement slabs on the ground rather than the traditional proper Queensland way. Do you think that's an issue at all we should be concerned about?
Well, it has to be, Scott, because the more concrete and that builders build, that therefore means that's less, the opportunity cost is less ground that could absorb rainwaters, absolutely. So yes, more concrete in terms of housing and the associated infrastructure like roads, railways, etc., will of course have concomitant effects on not only amplifying water flows from rain events, but diverting them in different ways, and that's why we also see different flood events have different effects on the ground due to the fact that after every flood event there's been either deconstruction or construction or both, which means that water flows in different ways than may have been recorded before, and therefore that may have been intended. So yes, house design is an issue for sure. Of course, house design has house costs, and we know that we're in the middle of a housing crisis at the moment, and one will then instantly expect that if one conceives of more flood resilient design, building industry types may well say, well, that's going to increase the cost of housing, and what's the greater benefit? We're in a housing crisis as it is. And that's something I try to address in the book, that when in the topic about planning and policies and circularity, is that there's opportunity costs everywhere. Yeah. What one sector of society might say is the silver bullet will be seen by another as being in fact the direct opposite and will worsen.
We'll come back to looking at the future later on. Now that we had after the 2011 flood, which you have a chapter in your book about 2011 flood, we had a Royal Commission into that.
Yes.
And that Royal Commission's been criticised a bit because it focused a lot on statistics and figures and should water have been released and not released, and about the behaviour of the the people in charge, the engineers in charge of that. What's your assessment of that 2011 event, if you like, and the Royal Commission, if you want to make comments?
Well, in my book, Brisbane Breached, I really wanted to highlight the difference between the 2011 event and the 2022 event in terms of the chasm of difference, quite frankly, between the fact that 2011 was preceded by the concept of quote-unquote December flood event, which meant that there was so much rain that had fallen in and around Wivenhoe Dam in the last months of 2010 that Wivenhoe actually breached its 67 metre minor flood level, which meant that when the truly impactful rains happened, there was no water capacity storage left in Wivenhoe. Compared to 2022, when we'd had a long 7-year drought preceding it, which meant that Wivenhoe had capacity and meant that it didn't have to disgorge any waters into Brisbane, and therefore the loss and damage was caused in Brisbane rather than outside of Brisbane. And you mentioned the Royal Commission. Well, one can't help but notice the clear and obvious difference is that there was no Royal Commission after February 2022, nor litigation, and nor any such clamour for such litigation. So, which again just goes to show that it's not about the dams per se, but dam capacity that was the ultimate arbiter of who was damaged and where. Having said that, of course, there were people and places that were damaged just as equally in both events, despite those differing dynamics. The haplessly flood-prone suburbs of Goodna and Rosalie being prime examples of bad memories coming back 11 months later.
Okay, it's a very important point, the memory. Now, you've got a chapter on lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yes. D-A-M-M-E-D.
Now, this is a lovely saying, of course, because us poor public are often inundated, sorry the pun,
yes,
with statistics, and sometimes you don't know who to believe, and I know we should always believe government statistics, but tell us, what's your take on the statistics issue?
Well, the thing about dams is one has to conceive of where would we put dams. Dams have to be placed, and again it comes back to that opportunity cost. Farming, housing, transport, development. That's every single dam will have that. Will have that cost. So, and I can't help but notice that the Newman government, which was definitely not squeamish when it came to infrastructure projects, could only conceive of two places in which to put dams, namely Laurel View, southwest of Ipswich, and Linville, which is in the far northwestern reaches of the Brisbane River catchment. So, and both of those dams, if they were built, Scott, wouldn't have really done much, if anything, to have withheld what we saw in the February event of 2.5 years ago.
Now, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
You can tell me if this is a myth or not,
Yes.
Now, there's a lot of talk that the Goss government, that came in and the Wolferdine Dam was going to get built in the back of the Gold Coast area, and they reneged on that and changed that. Would that have made any difference, or was that just a myth?
It's a myth for this reason. Wolfdean would have dammed the Albert River, and it would have had absolutely no impact on the last two flood events because the Albert River doesn't go anywhere near Brisbane. The argument for the Wolfdean Dam was that, and if you drive through that, as I have done, on the way between Beenleigh and Mount Tamborine, the argument for it is it gets more rain than the Wivenhoe catchment, and B, it tends to be in more shade as a result of its closeness to Mount Tamborine. So it was a dam that, if built, would have filled more rapidly and been more likely to stay filled. It would have been good
for water storage.
Yes, and that was the science behind it. And the irony is that had the 74 floods not happened, that dam would have gone ahead. However, when 74 happened, suddenly the water supply imperative became a flood mitigation imperative. Hence the myth. If you really want to talk about a myth, Scott, the myth was that Wivenhoe would permanently flood-proof Brisbane. Wolfdean was placed on the back burner, and by the time it came back on the front burner, we know, and it gets back to the opportunity cost, that so much more housing development had gone on what was previously farmland. And again, if you drive through there today, it's houses everywhere. Yeah. And so that created a cohort of people who said, well, no, we're not having our houses resumed we'll have a big fight about it. And it was the Russell Cooper government of 1989 that was pledging that dam that was voted out because Goss said, I won't put the dam in, and he didn't. And of course, he didn't renege on a promise, and the people were happy there. But some could argue that as a result of that decision, we are, as a broader Brisbane-based populace, at more risk of water supply shortage, because that's just left us with Wivenhoe and Somerset as our workhorses. And again, you look at that inexorable downward trend from 2015 to 22, Wivenhoe's capacity went down rather quickly and unnervingly, and that's the risk we face in the lead up to the Olympic Games.
Which I hope we won't have. But anyway, that's another story.
Well, if we have the games, I don't think the games per se are going to have too much of an impact on the water storage itself.
It's going to have an impact on my rates. I know that.
However, you mentioned the games. I mean, if that'll also feed the decision about where to put the stadium, if anywhere, and that brings in Hamilton as an idea, because Hamilton, arguably, in my view, and I've written about that in the book, is a place where you could repurpose old broken down factories and replace them with things like a stadium and with proper housing to house people because of its proximity to the rail line. And as proven by 2011 and 22, when that area of the river didn't flood, because if you ever go to Portside, which is close by, you see just how wide the river is there, and it can convey the floodwaters out to the bay rather than overtop the banks and cause flooding.
Now, all this is worrying, giving me alarm bells. No one seems to be in charge. Who is in charge of making all these decisions? We do have a state government, I thought, somewhere along the way. You do have a chapter on planning and politics.
Yes.
I know politics has nothing to do with these sort of decisions at all.
No.
So it seems that no one is looking ahead or planning ahead. We used to have in Queensland the Coordinator General's office, which I thought way back in the Joe era was quite effective. I might be wrong on that, but the Coordinator General I met was pretty impressive. But that's been watered down. So who is in charge of all these decisions? Is it basically a state government responsibility, or can we blame Canberra? Can we blame Canberra for something else?
I don't think Canberra really could be blamed in this
respect.
It is state, as the example of Goss and Cooper and Wolfdean came to show. But it is very much water supply is a state government responsibility, and hence the two main entities, Seqwater and Sunwater, are fully 100% GOCs owned by the state government. So yes, it really is in the remit of the parliamentarians in Queensland to work on water supply and damming issues. It's very much within their remit, and I'm not saying there aren't places within the broader state of Queensland that aren't good candidates for dams. I'm solely focused on the Brisbane River catchment and the peculiar issues that pertain to Brisbane rather than elsewhere in Queensland. But yes, definitely state government. City council doesn't have a great deal of jurisdiction because its jurisdiction is more in respect of creeks. And I guess, to answer your question more fully, we shouldn't forget that the moniker of Brisbane as the river city is a bit of a misnomer. We are, if anything, the creeks city or the creeked city, because we were...
That wouldn't look well in tourism.
No, it wouldn't, but 2022 proved it, because we are... Look, we were creeked, C-R-E-E-K-E-D. Kedron Brook, which is just a tiny, serene little babbling brook, probably as narrow as this little alcove we're sitting in, Scott, turned into this raging behemoth. And don't blame Wivenhoe Dam for this, because Kedron Brook is completely independent of the Brisbane River. And my point being is that Brisbane in 2022 was affected because so many of the little creeks were so overflowing and swollen by excessive rain that fell literally from the sky. Creeks that really played next to no part in 2011 because there wasn't a great deal of rain that fell in Brisbane, at least not compared to the 2022 event.
Well, what worries me as a sort of person who lives in Brisbane, but fortunately I'm on top of the hill.
Yes.
And fortunately my house is on stilts, so it's quite okay. So I don't really care about what's going on, but I do care about, we seem to be making very poor planning decisions. Everyone seems to be sort of past the parcel about who's responsible for that. I also, it's interesting, David, you've written this book. I haven't seen anything come out from University of Queensland type people on these sort of issues. Are you a lone voice on this issue, or should we expect a bit more from our taxpayer-funded universities?
I think I'm a lone voice insofar as I bring the barrister's perspective to both this book and a book I wrote earlier, Brisbane Breached, which are what I would call hybrid books, insofar as they're a hybrid of case law analysis, namely the post-GFC 2007 onwards breach contract cases of the Tennyson Reach apartment complex. And in this case, Brisbane Breached, my focus was on the 2011 floods class action lawsuit failure, which is why Chapter 5, the biggest chapter, goes into that failure, goes into the reasons why it failed. And then otherwise, bookending the middle chapter are the observations and the politics and the photographs that I've taken. So in a way, I'm not aware of any other writer who brings both a barrister's perspective to these hybrid books before, namely case law analysis as well as general analysis. So, that probably could be because barristers and lawyers are by definition very busy people, and it's hard to find the time for these things. And I swore I would never write again, except that
until we asked you to write another one. Okay.
Well, within 6 months, two pretexts arose, Scott. Namely, September 2021, the Court of Appeal New South Wales delivered the decision that I always foreshadowed would happen, namely the floods class action would fail. But anyway, I sat on that and rested on that laurel until February 2022 when this happened, and suddenly I had, well, now I can write again because I've suddenly, the pretexts aligned. Exactly.
Has anyone from universities contacted you about your book?
I can't say they have, no.
The environmental group out there when they're worrying about climate change?
To be perfectly frank with you, it's been all the other way around. I've been pitching the book to peer reviewers, no, not the other way around. So, but anyway, I'm happy to chat and talk to anyone who might want to have a chat about it.
Yeah, well, what worries me is that we're relying on people like you. No criticism intended, but you're not being supported or given enough room, if you like, to make further comments to wider forums. And who do we as citizens, who do we talk to about trying to get these issues addressed? These things aren't going to go away, are they? We're going to get another flood sometime in the near future, aren't we?
Yes, and that's why when I launched the book, completely independently of the fact that it was an election year, it's just the way matters transpired, but I nonetheless advocated that parliamentarians or would-be parliamentarians in our state, given that the state is where so much of the responsibilities lie, and we of course had a state election a mere matter of weeks ago, that they need to grasp the nettle of what's stated in this book, namely the opportunity costs involved in housing people, watering people, but also not creating flooding issues, bearing in mind the twin dynamics of Wivenhoe and Somerset dams, which are simultaneously water supply and flood mitigation. As the Court of Appeal in New South Wales made clear in their judgment, it is a conflict. It's a conflict that's baked into the legislation, and so long as that conflict exists, yes, there'll be all sorts of difficult discussions for politicians to have to grapple with.
Okay, well, thanks very much. It's been really interesting, and you've laid out the problems, and of course we don't expect you to have all the solutions, but you've certainly highlighted where we should be looking at some of these things for the future.
Yes.
What would be your final message to, if Mr. Christopher was here, what would you be saying to him?
Well, I would be saying, as I said in my concluding paragraph, Scott, that dam construction in and around southeast Queensland is a no-goer for the reasons I've stated. That as a true leader of the state of Queensland, he will have to do not dissimilarly to what Peter Beattie did in the midst of a genuine and prolonged drought, is exhort about the need to conserve water and not to waste water, which is a false sense of security that I believe that we have. We've ridden on those coattails for a long time, and it was only the millennium drought of 2007 that finally made the populace actually agree. The trouble was that mindset, Scott, was literally and metaphorically washed away with the floodwater of 2011, and we didn't recall all of that because a mere 11 years later, what happened? Another flood. And my fear is that the population might think, well, Brisbane is not a drought-defaulted floodplain anymore, but rather that we are a flood-defaulted floodplain. Now, the floodplain aspect is correct because there will always be a floodplain and that will never go away. However, the drought default is what I believe. Empirically, it's been proven to be the default, and it will continue to be, because even if we get more heavy rains, the problem is that the more people that move here and migrate here, the greater the demand on the water supply infrastructure, the greater the demand on the dams, the quicker, therefore, the dam levels will drop in a phase of dry weather. That we will fear, or the fear of an Armageddon scenario. That could well happen again, and it will happen more swiftly than previously, simply because the demand is so high and it's growing. And unless we take steps to try and use active demand management, that's something that we must take that into account. Otherwise, the risk is that we could well run out of water. It's a very clear and present risk, and we must take that on board. And that's what I would exhort our Premier, if he was here today, I'd be saying exactly that.
Well, look, before the election, I did contact the Shadow Minister for Dams, who had never put a press release out at all about dams. So I don't know what the government policy is on dams or anything else.
The name of them,
but hopefully this will get seen by some people. And I'd like to thank you very much for the book you've done, and I urge people to purchase it and read it, and hopefully we can make some action so we don't have the same problems in the future.
Yes.
Congratulations and well done.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you.
Excellent.